to go and to tell Pharaoh to let Israel go to worship him, we saw that the comfort that God gave and the promises or the words that God gave to Moses was his presence. His presence. So there we were able to see in verse 14 of chapter 3 when Moses asked, what is he going to tell the sons of Israel? Who has sent him and what is God's name? Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, this is one of those significant statements that we read in Scripture that reveals what may be the essence of the character of God, that he is the self-sufficient one. He, in that sense, he is the only being that is a non-contingent being. And so there's aspects to which people have looked at God answering Moses's question with I am, and that there is so much that is loaded into the name of God, which is just the verb to be. But it also may be that what God especially intends when he answers Moses with I am, and particularly the last statement in verse 14, I am has sent me to you. There's a sense in which, since God's name is to be, it also is an aspect of God's answer that means to Moses, I will be with you. If I am is sending you, the eternal being, and he's also saying that he will be present with you, then the confidence or assurance that is given to Moses is the presence of God. And so that's where we left off, that the significant feature that what Exodus takes us, we go from Egypt and enslavement to the very presence of God coming and filling the tabernacle. That's the huge transition that takes place in the book of Exodus. But at the same time, we're able to see that the God who will fill the tabernacle is also the God who promised that he will be with Moses to go before Pharaoh and to speak to Israel. So that's where we ended last week. The presence, God's presence to the shepherd to lead Israel to Sinai is that he will be with him to do what he calls him to do. And in this way, we see that God's presence and God's actions in Exodus are the assurance and the comfort that we will see over and over again. But when we go further, we're going to take up some other significant things that occur from the end of, really starting in verse 16 of chapter 3 and looking through all of chapter 4, where this is just before the battle begins between God and Pharaoh, which you may know that Pharaoh was thought to be a god. And so in one sense, we're going to call it the battle between two gods, the true and living God of Israel, Yahweh, and the false god, who in one sense is Pharaoh. But what happens is in chapter 3, verses 16 all the way through verse 23 in chapter 4, is there's a revelation before all the events of the Exodus that is given to Moses, so that Moses is actually given the understanding of all the events that God tells him he is going to do. And so in verse 17, we're able to see that one aspect of Moses' understanding of all the events of the Exodus they are the fulfillment of God's covenant promises. So God is being faithful to his promises in the events of the Exodus. If you look at verse 16, go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I indeed care about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and to the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, what is the significance of the land filled up with all these ites and God actually caring about what is happening to the sons of Jacob and Israel? Like, why? He's remembering the promise that he made to their fathers, which is the covenant with Abraham, right? So we have to, therefore, before we even read of the events that bring forth the exodus of Israel, we're given the, in one sense, the theological covenantal lens that we are to interpret them as. These acts of God of judgment against Egypt and deliverance of Israel is God keeping his covenant promise to Abraham. So this is the continuation of God fulfilling that promise that he made to Abraham. The other thing that we are able to see that God has another purpose, and he'll bring forth another result that comes from the events of the Exodus, even before he tells Moses what they will be. Verse 18, they will listen to your voice, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you all will say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not give you permission to go except by a strong hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wondrous deeds, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty. Now that also is in fulfillment to what God promised in Genesis 15 to Abraham. But we're able to see who's going to rule in the events of the Exodus. God is. All right, so we're going to sort of drop into these. We probably will not go as slow as maybe we would like to, but as we look through these events, we're going to see that while it is a battle, the narrative is going to be a battle between Yahweh, as he is speaking his command through Moses to let Israel go, and Pharaoh, who is hardening his heart towards God. We're going to see God is reigning in all of it. God is sovereign all of it. God is sovereign over Pharaoh's hard heart. God is sovereign over the natural world that God uses for these plagues that are signs, so that God will bring about the results that he has intended the entire time, that he's going to make himself known. Now, in chapter 4, we are told about the signs, the miraculous signs that God says to Moses, this is what you're going to do. And he gives 3. All right, he gives 3 signs. But what we also learn, and this is very significant for understanding signs throughout Scripture, is that we are able to see, okay, what are signs for? What do signs do? And so in verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses answered and said, what if they will not believe me and will not listen to my voice? For they may say, Yahweh has not appeared to you. Okay, how would you interpret those Moses's objections, his questions, these potential situations?
Possible lack of faith.
Okay, could be lack of faith.
Or he's just worried that he's being given a job too big for him, and then he won't be able to convince the people of the truth.
And what does he know the people will need, or at least
They'll
they
need
should
some proof.
Yeah. And what are they looking for proof of?
God being with him.
That's right. So the question, in one sense, could be phrased this way. How do we know, Moses, that you speak for Yahweh? How do we know that your message is Yahweh's message? And how do we know that you are Yahweh's man? That's a way to phrase what I think Moses is asking. I don't think this yet, that we'll see later on very quickly. It does. I don't think Moses is doubting at this point. I think this is a question that's dealing with how will they know that I have been sent by you and these are your words? And so God now, in verse 2, begins with the signs that he will give Moses to show Israel. What is this in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. And Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand, and he took hold of it, and became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that Yahweh, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So verse 5 tells us what is the point of the sign of the staff that becomes a serpent. So what is the purpose of that sign?
That they may believe.
That's right. Signs are given to validate Moses is the man called by Yahweh who is speaking the message given to him by Yahweh. There's another sign that is also given to Moses. Verse 6, Yahweh furthermore said to him, now put your hand into your bosom. And so he put his hand into his bosom. He took it out, and behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then he said, return your hand into your bosom. So he returned his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it returned to being like the rest of his flesh. So it will be that if they will not believe you or listen to the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of this last sign. Daniel.
In chapter 3, where it says, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. When is it verse 16 where he says the Lord or Yahweh, the God of your fathers? Does God himself give his name? Is that where he gives his name?
He does give it here, and then he will also give it again. So we see I am who I am in verse 14. And it is from this that we do get Yahweh. Now, this isn't exactly the same as Yahweh, but this is why Yahweh is the covenant name of God.
Does Yahweh mean I am?
Yeah, it means, people would say it means the eternal one. Tim, what's another literal way that they translate the tetragrammaton?
As far as meaning itself,
it's the verb to be.
yeah.
So it's so your literal rendering of Yahweh is I am the one who is, or in that sense, it's you're wrestling with in what sense is the verb to be this way in which to describe the nature of God. And I think it's best to say it is saying that he is the eternal one, but it also is, it includes in it that he is also the one who is.
I heard it explained to me once. I heard it explained by R.C. Sproul that we are always in a state of becoming, but God is. He's never changing. We're always growing older or doing something. We're learning something, getting older, getting taller, whatever. But he exists and he never changes.
Yeah. I mean, there's good reason why you just can take the word Yahweh and you can just sort of like punt to all different directions about the character and nature of God. But it is here. But Chris, it will also come up again. And so we are going to deal with this again, and God will again give the covenant name as the God of Israel.
He says
this is the first time that it is said like this. Now we have seen Yahweh a lot already in Genesis and Exodus, but as far as God specifically saying, this is my name, this is the first time that it is revealed explicitly from God's mouth to his servant. I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel. And so if we go back to what is happening with these signs, we're able to see in the first sign and in the last sign, they are for the purpose that if Israel does not believe, the sign is to be given to Israel so that they will believe that Moses is the man and he indeed has Yahweh's message. That will be very significant, and this is one of the reasons that many Christians have a difficulty understanding the signs that signify Jesus and the apostles. And so it's wonderful how clear it is laid out to us for Moses prior to the events that lead to the Exodus, for us to understand in this biblical framework, why does God give signs to some of his people in one sense, in the genesis of the man and the message being authorized by God. That is what God will do with Elijah. That is what God did with Christ. That is what God did with the apostles. And here we see God doing it for the first time with Moses.
So I just looked at the signs, and it seems like the staff turning into a snake becomes something threatening, and then it turns back into something not threatening. And then he has the same thing with his hand. It's full of leprosy, which is really threatening, and it goes away. Is that of significance?
It's going to be of great significance, because if you are familiar with what happens to Israel as they wander in the wilderness because of unbelief, they will deal with serpents again. They will deal with leprosy again. And so he is also revealing in this that God is the one who can give curses and can also heal or retract the consequence of those curses. And so there's some foreshadowing to how God is also going to use serpents and leprosy as the one who has authority over these, in that sense, these threats of nature, these diseases of the flesh. And Moses has the power over both. That's the sign that is given. Now, in verse 9, there is another, and if it will be that they will not believe even these two signs, and that they will not listen to your voice, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry land, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. And so there is a third. This is all what God gives to Moses so that he is able to give to Israel signs so that Israel will believe that Moses is the man appointed by God to lead them out, and that Moses has God's message. Then Moses, and Chris, this is where we do see Moses does not have full faith in God's command. In verses 10 through 17, Moses says, "Please, Lord, I've never been a man of words, neither recently nor in the time past, nor since you have spoken to your slave, for I am one with a hard mouth and a hard tongue." Now, people debate what exactly does this mean. At least we can say on the surface, Moses is saying, I have difficulty speaking. And so Yahweh interprets, obviously rightly, what is behind these words from Moses. Verse 11, Yahweh said to him, "Who has made man's mouth, or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? So now go, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and will instruct you what you shall speak." All right, so here we do learn some significant things. Though God has chosen Moses to be his man and to speak his message to Pharaoh and to Israel, who is behind the man and the message? God. So the acts of the Exodus are whose acts? God's acts. And God even chose the messenger and the man so that it would clearly be evident who is doing the work to bring Israel out, to deliver and to redeem Israel. Is it the man? No, it is the God who has made him and who called him. So this will be another paradigm that will continue forth as we when you get to the book of Acts and you begin to understand, especially Paul brings this out. It is not the instruments that God chooses to use, it's the God who uses those instruments. This is the case with Moses. But God rebukes Moses. At the same time, God still attends to Moses, and he therefore allows for Aaron, his brother, the Levite, to speak for him, verse 14. And so now we're able to see that God has, in one sense, mercifully condescended even to the doubts of Moses about his challenges to speak, so that he has allowed for Aaron to be his mouthpiece. And then in verse 18, Moses now returns to Egypt. So all of this has taken place while Moses is where? He's in Midian. All right, Midian is in the region of Canaan. And we see, particularly on Mount Horeb, is where Moses met with God, and God appeared to Moses in the fire that was in a bush, but not consuming the bush. Right, that's going to be important because we'll see that they return there. Moses now returns, verse 18, to Egypt. But before he gets to Egypt, who does he see? Verse 18.
His father-in-law.
His father-in-law. And that's also, I think there is a way in which we're going to see that there's going to be a significant place where Jethro shows up. And that's going to indicate the significance of what God is doing through Moses, and particularly what is happening as they move towards Sinai. And so now we see Moses, who has the signs of God's presence, favor, authority. He returns and he is going to Israel. And by the end of chapter 4, verse 31, verse 29 and 30, Moses and Aaron, they gather the elders of the sons of Israel. Aaron speaks all the words Yahweh spoke to Moses. Moses did the signs in the sight of the people. Verse 31, and what does Israel do? They believe. Now, you and I would be able to think, how long is this going to last? But at least now we read in verse 31, Israel believes. Next, we go to there's some unique events, and we're going to jump over to this. This is in chapter 4. It's very strange, but it's very significant. In between the signs, Aaron being given as the mouthpiece, Moses and Aaron going, speaking, showing the signs, Israel believing. As Moses is leaving Midian, let's pick it up in verse 21. And Yahweh said to Moses, when you go to return to Egypt, see to it that all the miraculous wonders which I have put in your hand, that you do them before Pharaoh. But as for me, I will harden his heart with strength, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. Now, on one hand, this is significant because this sort of telescopes all the way to the end of the battle between these two gods. So we're able then to understand the 9 plagues that precede the 10th plague are those in God's ultimate plan, even as we see it revealed here to Moses. Was God seeking to bring Pharaoh to relent at plague 7? No. We know by way of this revelation to Moses, God was like, it's designed to go to 10. Because I said to Pharaoh, or I will say to Pharaoh through you, my son is Israel. My firstborn is Israel. let my son go. And Pharaoh will not. So God will take Pharaoh's firstborn. Now, here also is the significance that we can see is Pharaoh's son, the firstborn son of Pharaoh, was also judged to be God, in their view of God, so lowercase g. And therefore, that's why the firstborn would be the next Pharaoh, because their view is Pharaoh was a little God. And so you can see in the battle that unfolds in the narrative that leads to the Exodus, the battle between Yahweh and Pharaoh, the false god. Pharaoh is trying to kill Yahweh's firstborn, but Yahweh kills Pharaoh's firstborn. God is the God over all gods, and he will triumph. Right? So that's God's, in one sense, we could say God has a theological public relations campaign before all the nations and how he is going to bring Israel out of Egypt. That's what he reveals to Moses. But we also are able to see that how is it that God is going to bring Israel out of Egypt? It's going to relate to killing the firstborn so that God may deliver his firstborn, Israel, free to worship him. And then we get into this difficult passage. Verse 24, now it happened at the lodging place on the way that Yahweh encountered him and sought to put him to death. Now, when you read English, we have the same rule in English that we do in other languages. If you have a pronoun, what is the rules that you use to try to understand who does this pronoun refer to?
You look at the antecedent.
And what are some of the rules of knowing the antecedent?
Find the subject of the sentence.
All right. So one, we go by what's the closest antecedent. So in the order of the sentence, what is the closest antecedent? And then if you also had, so in this case, him, what gender is that? Male. And what number is that? Plural or singular? Singular. All right. So if you need to agree in person and number or gender if it works. And what's the nearest antecedent? This is where it's really difficult because it seems as if it would be Moses. It seems that it may be that the him put him to death might be referring to Moses because it seems that the previous hymn is referring to Moses. Now it happened at the lodging place on the way that Yahweh encountered him, thinking that is Moses because of the previous context, and sought to put him, that is Moses, to death. But then what follows adds some complexity to this. Then Zipporah, that's Moses's wife, Jethro's daughter, which, by the way, was she Jewish? Was she a descendant of Abraham? No. All right, she's a Midianite. All right, so Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his feet with it. And she said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. Now, this also has a bit of complexity as to understanding who is receiving what action of Zipporah. So we know that the son's foreskin is what Zipporah cut off. But we then get to the pronouns. Whose feet?
Moses' feet.
Could be Moses's feet. Could be their son. And what was the son's name? Sojourner. All right. Could be Sojourner's feet. But she then says, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. Now that clearly is to Moses.
Well, my version says she touched Moses' feet.
Yeah. And and they're making an interpretation for you so that you may know what they think is what is being referred to. The point here is that everyone agrees that this is not easy to understand who actually is receiving all of the actions that the his or him is referring to. It's either Moses that God, Yahweh, was seeking to put Moses to death, or God was seeking to put Moses' son to death, and what averted the death either of Moses or of the son? The circumcision of their son. And by touching the foreskin of the son, either to the son or to Moses, and this is where the word feet will just say, this word in Hebrew may not refer to feet. We'll let you figure it out, but in this company, we'll just say it's not something that we would generally talk about in mixed company. And nonetheless, we are able to see that it's also noted because of the placing of the foreskin on the feet. It is then associated with blood, because she says you are a bridegroom of blood to me. Now, this comes directly after God reveals to Moses, you're telling Pharaoh to let my firstborn son go. And because he won't, I'm going to kill his firstborn. And so it also seems like in the context, this may be related to Moses's firstborn son. I lean that way. I lean that way while at the same time saying, this is a really hard one to understand. It could be Moses, it could be his son. Today, I lean towards it's Moses's son, which indicates this. It indicates how was, in this case, I think Moses' son, but if I'm wrong, Moses, how was his son's life averted from God's wrath? Through blood. Through blood. Now, it also seems to reveal what had Moses failed to do. He failed to circumcise. So that which signifies one to be a descendant of Abraham, they were to circumcise their sons. And so Moses had failed to do this. So it may be that this is a component for why God is seeking to put him to death, because it was disobedience. It was a lack of faithfulness, and God takes that seriously. But I think it also is connecting with this larger point, which is where everything is going throughout the battle of the two gods. And that is, God is bringing this to where blood is going to atone for his people and purchase them to be his. And he's calling that people his son, Israel. That's very clear, right? So God here does call Israel his son, his firstborn son. And we're going to see that God is going to kill Pharaoh's firstborn son. And all of this is tied up with the Passover, where the blood of the lamb will be over the doorposts of Israel's households, so that their firstborn will not be slayed by the death angel, but will then also learn that's also how God now claims to have all the firstborn of Israel to be his own. So this is while it's strange and it's difficult, it's going to tie into what is at least one of the most significant aspects of what we learn through the Exodus. Mark.
His wife is son is the offspring of son of Abraham, illegitimate.
No, it because of the father, this would not be judged to be, in this case, I don't think we would judge this to be yeah. But we don't yet have, and this is going to be significant. I don't know if did we cover it last week? Maybe just things are in my mind that have not come out of my mouth. We're clearly able to see, because of Genesis 49, verse 10, what tribe are we expecting the king to come where the scepter will not pass from his hand? Judah. What tribe is Moses from?
Levi.
So what do we already know about Levi? I mean, what do we already know about Moses?
That he's not a descendant.
He's not that king. He's not that king. right? So I don't think, Mark, we're looking for a son when we think about these promises. We're not looking for a son from Moses to be the fulfillment of those promises. Now, the unique episode about the sons, Moses' firstborn, that maybe that's who God was showing up to take his life, the way in which blood from his circumcision of Moses' son averts God's wrath. At the same time, just after God said that he is going to kill Pharaoh's firstborn son, for Pharaoh refused to let his firstborn son Israel go and worship him. This one scholar explains this way: a strange story whose meaning has defied interpretation may shed some light on these events. Moses is retiring to Egypt with his family and has just been given a preview of the future. The first part of this passage is clear. Moses will do great wonders in Egypt, yet Pharaoh will still not release the children of Israel from bondage. This leads to a climactic disaster, the killing of the firstborn. In this act, there is a stunning revelation of Israel's identity. Israel is to be released as Yahweh's firstborn son. This bold theological move connects genealogy with God's purpose for the Exodus. There is an exceptional revelation of Israel to Israel. Israel is a firstborn son, a new humanity among, that should be nations, not myths. One in whom the image of God is transmitted. There is a subtle allusion to the ongoing enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. The salvation of God's son will be the death of Pharaohs. The oppression of Egypt strikes Israel's heel, but Israel's God strikes Egypt's head. Whoever the antecedent is supposed to be in verse 24, it seems that God, though partly caused by his anger for Moses' failure to circumcise his son, we are able to see that life-saving action comes when blood from his foreskin is used like an atoning sacrifice to avert God's wrath. And so we are able to see that this is going to function in a similar fashion to what the Passover is going to do for Israel. And so this is what happens with the plagues. We are able to understand, even before the battle begins, what is the end of the battle between the God of Israel and the God of Egypt. This is what now takes place, starting in chapter 5 and going all the way through chapter 12. And so I'm going to put these into rounds, right? So they're boxing. This is a great theater in one sense. This is the theater of the nations. Egypt is the great nation on the world stage. And so we have a boxing match. And round one is from we're going to jump to chapter 6, verse 28. The promise of deliverance is restated in the beginning, and then a genealogy of Moses and Aaron is stated. It's a partial genealogy. It doesn't include all of the sons of Jacob, and it, I think, is indicating the significance of Moses and Aaron and the role that they have been appointed to have. But in verse 28 of chapter 6, the battle begins and round one commences. And here Pharaoh increases the severity of affliction for oppressed Israel. And then we're able to see signs are explained and given in the first 7 verses for the very purpose, look at verse 5, that then the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. So what was one of the intended effects of God's public relations campaign among the nations? Yeah, who shall know? Then Egypt, yep. He is going to make Egypt know that I am Yahweh when he stretches out his hand. And so this then begins with the Aaron's staff becoming a serpent, and then the first plague, water is turned to blood. There's a great deal of significance, which all of these things are associated with the associations of the gods of Egypt with these particular aspects of creation. But another way to say it is, what happened when God judged the generation of man in the time of Noah? What did he use? Water, and water is a part of creation, right? Here we're able to see, what does God now also use to bring forth his judgment against Egypt? Creation. It's almost like a reverse of creation. God is kind of unhinging, one author said, creation on Israel for these different judgments. And so round one begins with the signs were given as commanded. The first plague, which indeed was not an accident, that it also dealt with the very way that Pharaoh tried to kill the sons of Israel by drowning them in the Nile. We then are able to see in the first 19 verses that the second plague was frogs and the third plague was gnats. I know I'm frustrating. You can get into the details of how this works, but here's the short end of it. Okay, the Nile turned actually into blood. Frogs, actual literal frogs, as described here, they were the instrument of God's judgment. Gnats, as described here, were the instruments of God's judgment. God unleashes, in like a reversal of creation, these destructive forces, showing indeed that he controls them, he's sovereign over them, but this also is the way in which God works in his judgment. That which God created to be a blessing and to be ordered and to give life, God now uses as the instrument of his judgments to threaten life. And so we're able to see in this first round that Pharaoh seems to be in control, because in the first round with these three plagues, this will continue also with the next two. So the first 5 rounds, it will be described that Pharaoh hardened his heart. Verse 15 of chapter 8, then Pharaoh saw there was relief, and he hardened his heart with firmness and did not listen to them as Yahweh had spoken. Then we are able to see verse 19, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened with strength, and he did not listen to them as Yahweh had spoken. Verse 23 of chapter 7, then Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not set his heart even on this. The way it's rendered in these plagues is it seems like Pharaoh is the one who kind of is directing things. Pharaoh's heart is what he is hardening. We get into round 2 and Yahweh brings 2 more plagues, and in these plagues he also is going to now distinguish between Israel and Egypt. The result of round 2 is that the magicians who were able to give imitations of the first 3, they are going to conclude in verse 9 of verse 11 of chapter 9 that they can't do what Moses is doing. For the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. And so the conclusion after the plague of flies, after the livestock die, and after the boils is that the magicians are no longer able to imitate what Yahweh is doing through Moses. And so now we see there is a shift that takes place. The first 2 plagues are rendered in such a way that it still seems as if Pharaoh is calling the shots. Pharaoh is hardening his heart. But in the last one, look at verse 12, chapter 9. And when I say the last one, I mean the sixth one. Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he did not listen to them, just as Yahweh had spoken to Moses. So the direct, who is attributed directly with hardening Pharaoh's heart in verse 12? Yahweh. First time it's been rendered once the battle has begun. Now this becomes the way in which it will be described henceforth. So as we go into round 3, starting in verse 13 of chapter 9, going through chapter 10, we're going to see through these plagues, the hail that comes, the locusts that come, and then concluding with the darkness that comes. This is moving toward that climactic last or 10th plague. But the way in which it is then rendered for us is now Yahweh is hardening Pharaoh's heart. Or in a different way, verse 35, Pharaoh's heart was hardened with strength. So the way in which Moses is narrating for us the events, the actual events of the Exodus, is done in such a manner that we are able to see who actually rules in this battle between Yahweh and Pharaoh. Who's ruling? Who's sovereign? The Lord is. What would happen if Pharaoh did not harden his heart?
I mean, if God didn't harden Pharaoh's heart,
If
or if Pharaoh didn't.
if Pharaoh's heart wasn't hardened, and he lets Israel go before the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. Yeah, he's not going to accomplish what accomplishes in the Passover.
Oh yeah, the symbolism of the coming of Jesus as the Lamb.
And it's not just going to. And I don't want to take. I'm not trying to take away from Christ as the ultimate fulfillment as the Passover, but we do have to reckon with Israel was redeemed as the covenant nation. We'll see in the Passover by the Passover lamb. The claim that God Yahweh has on Israel is on the basis of the Passover. So, and we'll see this explicitly stated in Exodus. But if Pharaoh would not have hardened his heart and would have relented and let Israel go before the Passover, then we would not have the relationship between God and Israel that we do have because of the Passover. But Pharaoh's heart had to be hardened so that God would go all the way to the 10th plague and kill Pharaoh's firstborn while redeeming all of the firstborn in Egypt and in Israel. Right? But the way that it's written is that we're able to see it seems as if Pharaoh was in control when in fact we then end the battle, round 3 and round 4, Yahweh was the one who was hardening Pharaoh's heart. Now, I've been teaching this in a way that just tries to go with the way in which Exodus is written, to move with the narrative of the text, which is not the same thing as to ask theological questions about what the text is saying. Now, I think you have to do both. But I think when it comes to reading Exodus, you need to read Exodus as it is written. And so when you ask theological questions like this, so who hardened Pharaoh's heart? You're going to say God. And will you also say Pharaoh? Yes. You'll say God and Pharaoh. But the narrative also enables us to see, was God ruling over Pharaoh hardening his heart? Yes. You can't read Exodus and not make that conclusion. That is the way Exodus reads. So that we have known the whole time that all of these plagues are not going to bring Pharaoh to soften his heart and let Israel go. Now, there's a number of occasions that there is a short-lived so-called softening of Pharaoh's heart, but that doesn't remain. It is in one sense an Old Testament sort of illustration of worldly sorrow that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. And so it therefore does not produce repentance that leads to life. Pharaoh therefore hardens his heart even after temporary relenting and letting Israel go. And therefore we are able to see that God is ruling to bring about his plan, which will bring Israel's redemption through the execution of God's judgment. Shelley.
Is this sort of like a picture of how God, I mean, I've heard that if you hear God's call and you reject him enough times, then he'll finally let you go your own way. I'm not saying it the right way, but there's this point where people are just, God just says, okay, you know, I'm done with you. You've had your opportunity. And I mean, could that be sort of like a picture of that in our lives, and the way people sort of suppress the truth of God and push him away until there's no bit of their conscience left for them to even see God?
We could say yes, and then we have to make some distinctions, because what we're presented in this account is we know what is going to happen.
Yeah.
So we know before we even read of the events that Pharaoh is going to have this role in God's plan.
So we knew that Pharaoh would harden his own heart to begin with.
Yeah. So therefore, we're able to make conclusions prior to reading the events of Pharaoh hardening his heart and not letting Israel go. When we come to the people that we live with, or the people that we're speaking to, whether it be our friends or our children or whomever, we know that there are realities that exist, such as you will reject the gospel, you will reject the truth, you will despise wisdom and instruction. You keep sowing the seeds that really make for a fool. You will one day be a fool. And we can think of these realities like there's a line that you cross. I don't necessarily know when that line is or how to point someone to a line, but I know that there is a reality that the Bible speaks to, that one actually sears their conscience so that it no longer functions, that they're able to know right from wrong. And they now say that which is evil is good and that which is good is evil. Like, those are realities that we know are true. Mm-hmm. But the ability to speak with authority or any kind of like definitive, you cross that line, I think we are able to do it with Pharaoh because God reveals these things to us in Scripture. We cannot do that in that kind of definitive, authoritative way with people. While we can warn them, do not harden your heart. Do not presume upon God's grace. That when he comes to you and he convicts you and he corrects you and he rebukes you, and you just spurn him, and or if it's like coming to the Lord's table and you're not dealing with sin that his Spirit convicts you of, that his church is calling, you need to take that to be deathly serious. And we should encourage people with those kinds of words, while at the same time realizing we know things about Pharaoh because of God's revelation that we're not going to know about others. It's a good question, Shelley. There's a lot of questions philosophically and theologically that arise from this. And I would just emphasize to us, those are good questions and they are necessary answers. Like, can you please explain the true moral culpability of Pharaoh in responding to Moses's command? if God already had predetermined that Pharaoh would harden his heart? So those are good philosophical questions. I just would want us to make sure that we also note that Exodus doesn't raise those questions. And Exodus continues to go forward and just explains to us Pharaoh hardened his heart and Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that the Spirit of God was able to inspire both of those in the same book and the same man through the same author. And there was seemingly no contradiction. And so I think that is therefore an example to us philosophically for how we should combine together questions that we bring to a text. And when the text just presents it, it's both true. Pharaoh hardened his heart and Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that is how we then fill in our answer. But there's a lot of other questions too that we could legitimately ask from this narrative, but the narrative itself doesn't ask these questions like we tend. Well, what then happens, and we knew that this was going to be the case, is Pharaoh does not let Israel go. Pharaoh, verse 27 of chapter 10, Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he was not willing to let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, "Get away from me, beware, do not see my face again, for in the day you see my face, you shall die." And Moses said, "As you have spoken, I shall never see your face again." And now we enter into the 10th plague. This is the place we knew we were going the whole time. And so Yahweh said to Moses, verse 1 of chapter 11, "One more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely." And so we see that instructions are now given. What Yahweh reveals to Moses is that Israel is to be instructed. We see in verse 2 that they're going to ask from their neighbor, each woman from her neighbor, articles of silver and articles of gold. Verse 4, Moses is told, "At midnight I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the servant girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as shall never be again. But for any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against a man or a beast, that you may know how Yahweh makes distinction between Egypt and Israel. Then all these your servants will come down to me and bow themselves before me, saying, 'Go out, you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will go out.' And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Then Yahweh said to Moses, 'Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my miraculous wonders will be multiplied in the land of Egypt.' Now Moses and Aaron did all these miraculous wonders before Pharaoh, yet Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of his land." All right, now pause. We then have the declaration of the 10th and final plague that will bring forth Israel's redemption. But in chapter 12, we now see instruction. This is teaching. And we're able to read this, and we know it's in the Torah, the book of Moses. Who is this teaching for in chapter 12? The people of Israel. Not just the people of Israel at the time of the Exodus. This is instruction so that the people of Israel would have continued to read it. And notice that it is explanations for the Passover lamb and the feast of unleavened bread. And all of that is before verse 29 then begins narrating the acts of the 10th plague. when the death angel comes and kills the firstborn of all of Egypt. Now, what we're going to be able to see is, therefore, it's like when the Lord Jesus at the Last Supper, what did he do before he instituted, or sort of like as he was instituting the Lord's Supper?
He was telling them to remember.
Yep.
He was teaching them that this is what they're gonna
This
do
is
from
what
now
you
on,
do, and to remember.
All right.
establishing it.
The memorial meal of Israel is framed up by Moses in exactly the same way that Jesus frames up the memorial meal of the church of communion. That Jesus explained to them, what is the bread? What is it for? What is the cup? And then, after he explained the bread, they took and they eat. After he explained the cup, they drank. So too, Moses in chapter 12 explains the Passover before they partake of the Passover. He explains the feast of unleavened bread before they partake of the feast of unleavened bread. And so the Passover meal becomes the memorial meal of Israel's deliverance, joined with the feast of unleavened bread. But more significantly, in chapter 13, and it'd be helpful if you read these two verses. Chapter 13, this is after the angel of death strikes down the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Verse 29, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captives who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And then we see Pharaoh commands that they indeed were to take both your flocks and your herds as you have spoken, and go and bless me also. Well, then we see in verse 13 what also took place through the Passover. Not only the preservation of the lives of the firstborn in Israel, but the first two verses in chapter 13, then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both of man and beast, it belongs to me. So prior to the first celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we are able to see that after the death angel comes, God also claims, because of the Passover, because God passed over the firstborn in Israel, God now claims all of Israel's firstborn are mine. Now, he doesn't use the words, but if you own something because you bought it, what do we tend not to call this word unless you maybe deal in some sort of technical forms of business. But what do you call that? You redeem it. So when we take in that sense, if we have some kind of like certification that says this is, you owe this to me, this is the certification that this thing is mine, you go and you say, I would like to redeem. Like maybe you say that about your coupons.
They used to do that with green stamps.
Yeah.
You redeem stamps.
All right. What the Passover did was not only destroy Pharaoh's firstborn and all the firstborn in Egypt so that they would know that Yahweh is God. The Passover purchased Israel to be God's. The Passover redeemed Israel such that now God owns the firstborn of every womb. Now you probably understand, how did you receive the inheritance? Through the firstborn. So if every firstborn of man or beasts in Israel is Yahweh's, then what is Yahweh's?
All of Israel.
All of Israel. Every family in Israel, every animal in Israel. So through the Passover, what we're able to see, not only is God executing judgment to his enemies such that they will know that Yahweh is God, but God also achieves the redemption by way of a substitutionary sacrifice being the way in which Israel is saved, but God also redeems. So this understanding of the people of God to be the redeemed people of God is not a New Testament invention. It is the Old Testament understanding. Israel was redeemed by God at the Passover, and therefore everything that comes from Israel in the future, it's Yahweh's. And that's why it will be stated in the Mosaic law that if you want your firstborn son, or if you have a cow that gives the firstborn, you will have to now go and purchase back from Yahweh that firstborn. For all of the firstborn are Yahweh's, both man and beast. It belongs to me. So we are able to see through the Passover that Israel indeed has been delivered, but deliverance comes through redemption, through purchase. Not only is the Exodus Israel being brought into the place where they will worship God and God will become present among them, it is also how God now purchases them on the basis of his mercy given to them through a substitutionary sacrifice. That's what Passover is. Now, I've not read much and just know that the details are there, but maybe for the sake of communicating at a bigger picture, we haven't dealt with some of the details. But this is all we're going to do tonight. We didn't make it to Sinai, but we made it out of Egypt. Not exactly across the Red Sea. That will happen at the end of 13. But we have been released by Pharaoh. Any questions before we close? And we're going to take up next week with the second part of 13 and make it to Sinai. No questions? All right.